The day director Emeka Nwosu destroyed my life, he was eating fried plantain. That detail has never left me. I can still see the grease on his fingers, still hear the sound of him chewing, while I stood in his doorway holding my phone with my daughter's school number on the screen. Chisholm was 6 years old and burning with fever on a clinic bed, crying for me, and I had walked to this man's office to ask for 2 minutes. Not 2 hours, not 2 days. 2 minutes before closing time to go and hold my sick child. He did not even look up from his plate. He waved his hand. I took that as permission. I picked up my bag, walked out of the Federal Ministry of Works, and drove to my daughter. By nightfall, her fever had broken. I held her small body against my chest and whispered, "Thank you to God." I did not know that while I was holding my child, Emeka Nwosu was signing my termination letter. My name is Adeso Konkwo, and I need you to understand who I was before all of this happened, because the story only makes sense if you understand what I had built and what it meant to me to lose it. I grew up in Onitsha, third of 5 children. My father was a petty trader who sold spare parts on Aweka Road, and my mother was a seamstress who worked from a wooden table under a mango tree in our compound. There was no cushion in my family. There was no fallback. Everything I ever had, I got by being the kind of person who showed up first and left last, who studied when others slept, who asked for nothing and simply worked until the work spoke for itself. I got a degree in public administration from the University of Nigeria in Nsukka. I passed my civil service examination on the first attempt. I secured a posting to the Federal Ministry of Works in Abuja at 27 years old, and I treated that appointment like it was sacred. Because for someone like me, no godfather, no connection, no uncle sitting on any board, a stable government job was not just employment, it was the foundation. It was the thing that made all other things possible, and I built my life on top of it the way you build on solid ground. I rented a 2-bedroom flat in Kubwa. I enrolled my daughter Shasam in a decent private school in Gwarimpa because the public school near us had 48 children in one classroom and one ceiling fan that did not work. I sent money to my mother in Onitsha every month without fail. I was not rich, but I was stable. And for a woman who had known nothing but uncertainty her entire life, stable felt like the greatest luxury in the world. For 4 years, I gave that ministry everything. I was in procurement and contract administration, and I was good at my job in the way that only people who genuinely care about their work can be good at something. I knew every file. I knew every process. My director before Nwosu, a quiet man named Alhaji Sule, who retired in 2022, used to tell me that I ran the department on memory alone. He was not entirely wrong. I had internalized that office the way some people internalize scripture. Then Alhaji Sule retired, and Director Emeka Nwosu arrived. From his very first week, Emeka Nwosu made it clear that the ministry existed to serve him. He redecorated his office at government expense. He created a new protocol requiring all staff to sign in and out under physical supervision, meaning if you arrived 1 minute after 8, your name was flagged. He held Monday morning meetings that had no agenda and existed purely so that he could sit at the head of a long table and feel important. He spoke to junior staff the way you speak to people you have already decided are beneath you. Not cruelly always, but dismissively, consistently, in a tone that reminded you every single day that your value in that building was entirely dependent on his goodwill. I kept my head down. I did my work. I told myself that men like Nwosu burned bright and fast, and that the institution would outlast him. I just needed to survive him. I was 31 years old and I had been surviving men like him my whole life. I thought I knew how. I did not know that on a Tuesday afternoon in March, everything I had built would crack open in the space of 60 seconds because of 2 minutes and because of a plate of fried plantain. The school nurse's name was Blessing. She called me at 2:43 in the afternoon, and her first words were, "Please don't panic, but Chisholm has a very high fever, and she has been crying for the past hour, and we really need you to come." Those words, "Please don't panic," are specifically designed to make you panic immediately. My hands went cold. My chest tightened. I pulled up Chisholm's face in my mind instantly. Her gap-toothed smile, the way she held my hand when she was scared, the way she still called for me in the night sometimes, even though she was 6 and trying very hard to be a big girl. I stood up from my desk, picked up my bag, and walked directly to Director Nwosu's office. The time was 2:56. Official closing was 3 o'clock. I was asking to leave 4 minutes early, though by the time I finished explaining and he responded, it would be 2 minutes, maybe less. His door was open. He was behind his desk, and he was eating. A white takeaway container of fried plantain and grilled chicken sat open in front of him, and he was working through it with the focused contentment of a man who had no outstanding concerns in the world. I knocked on the open door. He looked up. I explained everything. My daughter, the fever, the school calling, the fact that I had completed every single assigned task for the day, and my desk was fully cleared. I told him I was asking to leave a few minutes early and that I would be reachable on my phone if anything urgent came up. He looked at me. He chewed. He picked up another piece of plantain, and then he waved his hand, a single, lazy, dismissive wave. The kind of gesture you make at something that is mildly irritating but not worth your full attention. I took it as permission. Every reasonable person would have taken it as permission. I walked out. I drove to the school. Chisholm was sitting in the nurse's room with a wet cloth on her forehead, and when she saw me come through the door, she started crying immediately. Not from pain, but from relief. That specific kind of child's cry that only happens when the person they need most finally arrives. I held her against me and felt the heat radiating off her skin, and I carried her to the car and drove straight to the clinic on Gimbia Street. The doctor said it was malaria. He gave her medication. By 9 o'clock that night, her temperature had come down, and she was asleep in my arms in the plastic chair of the waiting room, with her mouth slightly open the way she always slept. I sat there in the fluorescent light of that clinic, my daughter's weight warm and heavy against my side, and I felt the particular exhaustion of a single mother who has held everything together through another crisis that nobody else was there to help with. I drove us home. I put her in her bed. I sat in the kitchen and drank cold water and allowed myself 5 minutes of just breathing. Then I went to sleep. I did not know that while I was in that clinic holding my daughter, Director Emeka Nwosu had already called HR, had already dictated the letter, had already instructed that my access be removed from the system before morning. When I arrived at the ministry gate at 7:45 the next day, Musa, the security guard, could not look me in the eyes. He is a good man, Musa. He has worked that gate for 11 years, and he has always greeted me by name every single morning. That morning he looked at the ground. He held the envelope with both hands. He said, "Madam, I'm sorry. They said I should give you this." The letter was one paragraph: gross insubordination, abandonment of duty post, conduct unbecoming of a civil servant, appointment terminated with immediate effect. I read it once. I read it again. I read it a third time, thinking surely I was misunderstanding something. Surely there was a context I was missing, a procedure that had been followed, some administrative step that made sense of what I was holding. There was nothing to misunderstand. Emeka Nwosu had ended 4 years of my career because I had left 2 minutes before 3 o'clock to pick up my sick 6-year-old daughter. I folded the letter. I put it in my bag. I walked back to my car with the morning sun already hot on my face. I sat inside with the engine off and I gripped the steering wheel with both hands and I stared at the windshield. The thing that broke first was not my composure. It was my plan. Everything I had built my life around, the flat in Kubwa, Chisholm's school fees, my mother's monthly money, all of it had just been balanced on a single appointment that a man with greasy fingers. There is a specific kind of darkness that comes not from sadness, but from calculation. When you are grieving something emotional, a relationship, a loss, the darkness is heavy and soft, and it wraps around you like a weight. But when you are sitting on your kitchen floor doing the mathematics of survival, and every number's coming out wrong, the darkness is cold and sharp and it has edges. That is where I was in the 3 days after the letter. Not just heartbroken, calculating, counting, running the same numbers over and over, hoping the different answer would appear. Rent, 45,000 naira, due in 16 days. Chisholm's school fees for the term, 62,000 naira, 2 weeks overdue already. Feeding, transportation, electricity. My savings account held enough to cover exactly 6 weeks of basic expenses if I spent nothing that was not absolutely essential. After 6 weeks, the floor would disappear. My sister Obiageli called from Enugu, and I made the mistake of telling her the truth. She cried. She prayed loudly over the phone for 7 minutes. Then she said she would send what she could, and she sent 5,000 naira and a voice note telling me that God was in control. I love my sister. I love her completely. But I sat looking at that 5,000 naira credit alert in my banking app, and I felt something I am not proud of. I felt the particular loneliness of a person whose crisis is bigger than the people who love them are equipped to meet. I called a lawyer, a man I knew from university named Tobachukwu, who had gone into employment law. He listened to everything I told him, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Adas, you have a strong case. A very strong case. Wrongful termination, procedural violation, failure of fair hearing." He said it clearly and with conviction. Then he said the case would take a minimum of 2 to 3 years to resolve in the Civil Service Tribunal. 2 to 3 years. I sat with that number. Chisholm would be 8 or 9 years old before I saw any outcome from a courtroom. She would have changed schools twice, probably. We would have moved. My mother in Onitsha would have gone months without her money. Everything I had fought to hold stable would have shifted beyond recognition. I thanked Tobachukwu. I told him I would think about it. I put the phone down on the kitchen table, and I sat on the floor. I don't know why the floor. I just could not hold the weight of myself in a chair anymore. And I looked across the room at Chisholm, who was lying on the couch watching cartoons with a biscuit in her hand. She looked over at me and said, "Mummy, why are you sitting on the floor?" And I said, "I'm just resting, baby." And she accepted that the way children accept inexplicable adult behavior and turned back to her cartoons. And I sat on that floor and I thought about what I knew. Because here is what Emeka Nwosu did not consider when he signed that termination letter. Here is what arrogant men in positions of power consistently fail to account for. The person they are removing from the building does not leave their memories behind when they go. 4 years of institutional knowledge walks out with me. 4 years of watching, 4 years of processing, 4 years of filing documents and reading figures and noticing things that did not add up and making a mental note and moving on because I needed my job and I needed to survive and I could not afford to be the woman who caused trouble. I could not afford to cause trouble then. My circumstances had changed. Let me tell you what 4 years inside a federal government procurement department actually looks like from the inside. Every contract that the Federal Ministry of Works awards has to pass through a process. There is an advertisement of the tender. There is a bidding period. There are technical and financial evaluations. There are approval stages, from the procurement officer to the director to the ministerial tenders board for anything above a certain threshold. On paper, it is a rigorous, accountable system designed to ensure that public funds are spent transparently and that contracts go to qualified vendors who deliver real work. On paper. In practice, in that specific office, under that specific director, what I watched was a machine, a quiet, efficient, well-oiled machine for moving government money into private pockets. And I am going to describe it to you in detail because I need you to understand not just that corruption was happening, but how precisely it was constructed, how deliberate it was, how many layers of paperwork surrounded it specifically so that if anyone ever looked, they would find documents, correct, signed, stamped documents, that pointed nowhere incriminating unless you knew exactly what you were looking at. And I knew exactly what I was looking at. The first pattern I noticed was in 2022, about 8 months after Nwosu arrived. A construction contract was awarded for the rehabilitation of a federal road in Kogi State. 47 kilometers of road surface, drainage work, and bridge repair. The contract value was 243 million naira. The winning company was called Goldbridge Construction and Engineering Limited. I processed the paperwork. The bid evaluation looked clean. The company had registration documents, tax clearance, previous project references, everything. I filed it and moved on. In early 2023, I was in the ministry's archive room retrieving an older file, and I came across the project monitoring report for that Kogi Road. The report, submitted by the ministry's field engineers, stated that the contractor had mobilized to site, commenced preliminary work, and then abandoned the project. 43% completion. The report recommended the engagement of another contractor to complete the outstanding work and the recovery of the advance payment from Goldbridge. I noted it. I went back to my desk. I did not say anything because what I had read was a monitoring report, and monitoring reports feeding into recovery proceedings were technically an administrative matter that sat outside my direct unit. I had no formal reason to raise it. But I remembered it. The second pattern was the supplier I privately came to think of as the ghost, a company called Triton Excel Supplies and Services, registered in March 2022. Won their first federal bid in June 2022, a procurement contract for office equipment and computers across 3 ministry departments, value 48 million naira. Won again in October 2022, this time for vehicle maintenance services across the ministry's fleet. Value 71 million naira. Won again in February 2023 for a supplies contract. Won again in July 2023. 4 contracts in 18 months totaling over 1,100,000,000 naira. One afternoon, I looked up their registered business address out of straightforward professional curiosity. I was verifying an invoice detail and needed to cross-check their registration documents. The address listed was Plot 17B, Dawaki Extension, Lugbe, Abuja. I passed through that area sometimes on my route home. The next time I did, I slowed down at the plot number. There was a rusted gate. There was scrub grass growing through cracked concrete. There was no building. There was no office. There was no company. There was a plot of empty land registered to a supplier that the Federal Ministry of Works had paid over 1 billion naira in 18 months. I drove home that evening with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind moving very fast behind my eyes. I thought about what I was looking at. I thought about who would believe me if I said something and who would not. I thought about Chisim's school fees. I thought about my mother. I thought about Emeka Nwosu and the way he looked at junior staff like we were furniture that had not yet been polished to his satisfaction. I said nothing. I filed everything. I kept working. I told myself it was not my war, until he made it my war. I gave myself 3 days to grieve, 3 days to cry on the floor, to panic about money, to call my sister, to sit in the dark. On the 4th day, I woke up at 5 in the morning, made tea, sat at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and began to build. I want to be precise about this part of the story because I think it matters. I did not do anything illegal. I did not steal documents. I did not hack into any system. Everything I worked from was either in my own memory, 4 years of detailed professional memory, or in copies of documents I had legitimately taken home during my employment to enable me to work late, copies that lived in a folder on my personal laptop that I had never thought to delete because I had never imagined I would need them. Payment approval memos, contract award letters, bid evaluation score sheets, supplier registration documents, all of it ordinary, administrative, unremarkable paper that together painted a picture so clear that I could not understand in those 4 days of building how nobody had seen it yet. But I knew why nobody had seen it, because nobody was meant to see it. The machine was designed so that each person in the chain only saw their one piece. The procurement officer saw the bid, the finance officer saw the payment request, the monitoring officer saw the field report. Nobody was sitting with all the pieces simultaneously. Nobody except me, because I had spent 4 years in that office treating every file that passed through my hands as something worth understanding completely. I organized the package by category. Abandoned or fictitious contracts, I identified 7, with full contract numbers, award dates, values, and the field monitoring reports that confirm non-delivery or abandonment. Ghost suppliers, I documented 4 companies with the same pattern as Triton Excel. Recent registration, no verifiable physical presence, repeated contract wins under the same director. I cross-referenced payment confirmation documents against bank accounts where I had them. I mapped the timeline of each contract against Nwosu's tenure. Every single anomaly I had identified began within his first quarter. I wrote a covering summary of 11 pages. Clear, professional, factual. No emotion, no accusation beyond what the documents themselves demonstrated. I wrote it the way I had been trained to write government reports, precisely, evidentially, with every claim traceable to a specific document reference. On Thursday night, I went to the ICPC website. I found the whistleblower and public complaints portal. I read the submission guidelines 4 times. I compiled everything into a single compressed folder, 43 documents, my 11-page summary, in a clear index so that whoever opened it would understand immediately what they were looking at and why it mattered. Chisholm was asleep. The apartment was quiet. My kitchen light cast a yellow circle across the table, and everything outside that circle was dark. My hands were shaking. I am not embarrassed to say that. My hands were shaking because I understood what I was doing. I understood that I was pressing a button that I could not unpress, that what I was submitting had the potential to move through a federal institution and come out the other side as something that destroyed a man's career and possibly his freedom, that there was no version of this where I pressed submit and nothing happened. I thought about Chisholm. I thought about the Kogi road that was never built, the communities that needed that road, the children who rode motorcycles on broken dirt paths in the rain because 43% of a federal contract had been abandoned. I thought about the 1 billion naira that had flowed into an empty plot of land in Lugbe, while civil servants like me worried about school fees. I pressed submit. I sat back in my chair. I put my hands flat on the table. I looked at the ceiling, and then I got up, washed my teacup, checked on Chisholm, and went to bed. I did not sleep for a long time, but I went to bed. Nobody prepares you for the silence after you do something enormous. You imagine that an action of that scale produces an immediate response: alarm bells, phone calls, the sensation of wheels beginning to turn. What actually happens is nothing. You wake up the next morning and the sun is the same, and your daughter wants her Milo before school, and you are out of milk, and you have to run to the kiosk on the corner, and everything is exactly as ordinary as it was before you changed the direction of your life the night before. I took a data entry job at a logistics company in Woos too. The pay was 40,000 naira a month, less than half of what I had earned at the ministry, but it covered feeding and kept my account from going to zero while I waited for whatever was going to happen to happen. I woke up at 5:30 every morning, made Chisholm's breakfast, dropped her at school, took the BRT to Woos, sat at a desk entering shipment data into a spreadsheet for 8 hours, collected my daughter in the evening, cooked dinner, helped with homework, put her to bed, and sat alone in my kitchen in the dark, wondering if I had aimed at something too big and missed. Week 1 passed, week 2, week 3. I checked the ICPC website compulsively, as if there would be a public announcement of a received submission. There was nothing. I called the General Inquiries line once, and a man told me they could not confirm or deny any specific complaint, and that all submissions were handled confidentially. I thanked him and hung up and went back to my spreadsheet. Week 4, week 5. I began to lose faith. Not in what I had submitted. I knew what I had submitted was real and documented and undeniable. I began to lose faith in the system's willingness to act on it, because that is the thing about institutional corruption that most people do not fully reckon with until they are standing directly inside it. The very systems designed to address the corruption are staffed by people who exist within the same culture that produced the corruption. What guarantee did I have that my submission had not landed on the desk of someone who knew Emeka Nwosu personally? Who owed him something? Who would make one quiet phone call and ensure the file disappeared? I sat with that fear for a long time. I carried it to work every day and brought it home every evening. And I did not tell anyone. Not Gozi from the ministry who called to check on me, not my sister, not Toba Chukwu the lawyer. I carried it alone because I had submitted it alone, and the only way I knew to hold something that heavy was the same way I had held everything heavy my entire life, quietly, privately, and without putting it down. 6 weeks after I pressed submit, on a Thursday morning, I was on the BRT heading to Woos when my phone rang. Ngozi does not call without a reason. I have known this about her since my first year at the ministry. She is a measured woman. She chooses her words the way you choose steps on unstable ground, carefully, deliberately, with full awareness of what each one might disturb. When her name appeared on my screen at 7:19 on a Thursday morning, I straightened in my seat and answered before the second ring. She was whispering. I could hear the ambience of the ministry corridor behind her, the familiar echo of that building's ground floor, the distant sound of a printer, someone's footsteps on terrazzo. She had clearly walked away from her desk to make this call. That alone told me everything I needed to know about the gravity of what she was about to say. She said, Adais, something is happening here this morning. I said, what is happening? She said, men came in the morning before most people arrived. She said there were 4 of them in plain clothes and they had identification. They went to the director's office first. She said Emeka Nwosu had arrived early. He had a ministerial meeting scheduled for 8 o'clock, and these men were waiting for him when he stepped out of the elevator. She said they spoke to him quietly in the corridor for less than a minute. She said they showed him a document. She said she could not hear what was said, but she could see his face from where she was standing at the far end of the corridor. She paused. Then she said, Adese, his face. I have worked in government offices for 17 years, and I have never seen a man's face do what his face did in that moment. She said they taped his office door. She said they removed his desktop computer and 3 filing cabinets on a trolley. She said they spoke to the ministry's permanent secretary and that the permanent secretary came out of that meeting looking like he had received news of a death. She said by 9 o'clock, the entire building knew that something federal was happening and that it involved procurement and that it involved figures that when people whispered them in the bathroom and the corridors, the numbers made people stop talking mid-sentence. She said, do you know anything about this? I looked out the bus window at the Abuja traffic moving slowly in the morning heat, at the Okadas weaving between cars, at a woman selling oranges on a roadside table, at the city doing what the city does every morning without knowing what is happening inside any individual life within it. I said, Ngozi, I am glad you called me. Please take care of yourself. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, okay, Adais. God is not sleeping. I said, no, he is not. I put the phone in my bag. I sat with my hands in my lap for the rest of the bus ride. The man beside me was listening to Fela through earphones, and his foot was tapping against the seat frame. A child 2 rows ahead was sleeping against her mother's arm. The bus smelled of morning of people who had woken early and were going somewhere they needed to be. I stared straight ahead and I breathed, and I let the thing I had been carrying alone for 6 weeks begin, very slowly, to put itself down. The federal audit took 11 weeks. I know this not because I was inside it, I was not. I know this because of what eventually became public, what Ngozi told me in careful installments over those weeks, and what I later read in the investigation report that the ICPC published in summary form as part of their transparency mandate. What the investigators found when they opened those filing cabinets and accessed those servers went beyond what I had submitted. Not because I had been incomplete, I had been thorough, but because my submission was the thread, and when they pulled it, the whole fabric came undone. My documentation had pointed them to specific contracts and specific suppliers. Their forensic access to ministry records and bank transaction data allowed them to map the full network, the shell companies, the related party transactions, the cash movement patterns, the phone records that place certain people in certain conversations at certain times. The total figure of fraudulent procurement across 3 financial years was 4.7 billion naira. Let me say that again slowly because I need you to feel the weight of it. 4.7 billion naira of public money, money budgeted for roads that were never tarred, for bridges that remained broken, for communities that kept waiting for infrastructure that was paid for and delivered nowhere except into private accounts. 4.7 billion naira that came from taxes and federation allocations and international development support, money that belonged to the Nigerian people, redirected through an office in Abuja by a man who waved his hand at me like I was a fly while he was eating his plantain. 4 contractors were indicted. 1 had a registered address that was an apartment in Lekki, Lagos, belonging to a relative of a ministry official. 2 junior officers who had co-signed falsified bid evaluations were suspended without pay pending prosecution. The ministry's internal audit unit was reorganized entirely. An Emeka Nwosu director, Emeka Nwosu, The man who had called himself a professional and surrounded himself with the language of standards and discipline. The man who had flagged staff for arriving 60 seconds late while he looted billions was placed on indefinite suspension. His passport was flagged, his accounts were frozen, and he was required to report to the ICPC office on Aguiyi Iransi Street in Maitama every Tuesday and Thursday, pending the completion of criminal proceedings. The man who had waved me away while eating fried plantain now spent his Tuesdays and Thursdays sitting in a waiting room chair, explaining himself to investigators. I read the summary report 3 times. I did not celebrate. I sat with it quietly, the way you sit with the end of something that cost you a great deal to finish. The Public Service Commission reviewed my termination case 4 months after the audit began. My union representative, a man named Chukwuemeka from the Senior Staff Association, who I had called on the advice of Toba Chukwu, the lawyer had filed a formal petition immediately after I was dismissed. Under normal circumstances, that petition would have sat in a queue for months, possibly longer, but circumstances were no longer normal. My termination was now administratively connected to the tenure of a director under federal investigation. The commission reviewed it in 6 weeks. Their finding was unambiguous. The termination was procedurally unlawful, lacking fair hearing, lacking documentation of an actual disciplinary process, and unsupported by the grounds stated in the dismissal letter. My appointment was reinstated. Full back pay for every month I had been absent, not partial, full. I received the letter on a Friday afternoon. I was at the logistics office in Wos, entering shipment data, when my phone buzzed with the email notification. I opened it at my desk. I read the subject line. I read the first paragraph. I put my phone face down on the desk, sat very still for approximately 30 seconds, then picked up my bag, told my supervisor I had a family emergency, and walked out to the car park. I sat in my car and I read the full letter twice. Then I called my mother in Onitsha. She picked up on the second ring the way she always does. I said, "Mama, I got my job back. I got everything back." She was quiet for 1 second, and then she started crying, that specific sound my mother makes when she is crying and trying not to. That soft, effortful sound. And I cried with her, both of us on the phone, saying nothing for a little while, because there was nothing that needed to be said. She knew what the past months had cost me. She had carried it with me from a distance. That was enough. I drove to Chisholm's school. I signed her out early for the first time since the day she had the fever, the day this all began. I took her to the ice cream place on Adetokambo at Amola Street, the one she loved, and I ordered her the chocolate and vanilla swirl in a waffle cone. She sat across from me at the little table with ice cream on her chin, completely happy, completely unaware, telling me about something funny her classmate Amika had done in class that morning. I watched her talk. I watched her small hands gesturing. I watched her gap-toothed smile, and I felt something settle inside me, something that had been standing on its edges for months, finally finding its feet. On Monday morning, I wore my best work dress. I pressed it the night before. I polished my shoes. I dropped Chisholm at school, drove to the Federal Ministry of Works, and walked to the security gate. Musa was there. He looked up from his post, and when he saw me coming, he stood up from his chair completely. He stood up the way you stand for someone. He said, "Madam Adaze, welcome back." He said it with his full chest, with his eyes looking directly into mine. And behind his words were 11 years of watching this gate and knowing what it meant when people walked back through it after the world had tried to keep them out. I touched my access card to the reader. It beeped. The light went green. I walked through. And that is the story of Adaeze Okonkwo, a woman who lost everything on a Tuesday afternoon because a powerful man did not think she mattered enough to look up from his plate. A woman who sat on her kitchen floor and counted what she had left, and decided that what she knew was worth more than what he had taken. A woman who pressed one button in a dark kitchen at midnight and watched 4.7 billion naira worth of stolen truth come crashing into the light. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something in your chest that you cannot quite name, if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere in those 10 chapters and forgot to let it go, then you already know that this is not just a story. This is the kind of truth that reminds you what ordinary people are capable of when the world pushes them far enough. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories of betrayal and resilience. Stories of people who were counted out and came back in ways nobody saw coming. Stories that will grip you from the first sentence and refuse to let you go until the very last word. All you have to do is subscribe to Tales by Nexus right now. Hit that subscribe button below this video. Turn on your notification bell so you never miss a story. Because the next story we are bringing you, it is going to hit even harder than this one. Tales by Nexus, where every story is real, every emotion is earned, and nobody leaves without feeling something. Subscribe now. We will see you in the next one.